The first sign that there's trouble is right there in the name, the Kalam cosmological argument. This is just one more spin on the flawed classical cosmological argument. All cosmological arguments basically try to apply causality to the origin of the universe to try and prove God's existence. The thing is, when you take cause and effect and go back to the origin of everything, you're left with two options: an infinite regress of causes and effects, or with something that had to have always existed, something that has a necessary existence, in which the theist's mind just has to be their particular God. The classical defeater for this is to ask, why can't the universe itself be necessary, or always have existed? The Kalam is just yet another variant of the argument that tries to give God a get-out-of-jail-free card by introducing the notion of timeless existence, and then trying to tie all of material reality to the existence of time. Then it just sprinkles on a little bit of modern cosmology to make it seem like the argument has significant scientific support, when it really doesn't. Now, there are a lot of philosophical objections that could be brought against the Kalam, but I want to focus on the two that I think are the most straightforward. If you remember back to my definitions video and the distinction between efficient and material causes that happens in this argument, then the first objection I have is to say that we can't have an effect that has no material cause. This is a strong objection because the only justification Dr. Craig has for his premise 1 of the Kalam is intuition and common experience. If you try to challenge Dr. Craig on his premise 1, he'll largely just call you disingenuous and state that you can't be doing any serious metaphysics without it. YouTuber Sisyphus Redeemed has a great video exposing why trying to get premise 1 of the Kalam accepted as a universal truth using only intuition and personal experience as justification is a fallacy all on its own, and I recommend checking his video out. There's going to be a link to it in the description box. The problem for Dr. Craig is that even if we grant this universal principle of causality, he's going to have another set of problems, because we could just as easily use the same justification that he does to establish the premise that everything material that exists has a material cause, from which it flows logically that something material must have always existed. And that's theologically objectionable to Dr. Craig and other Christians who want a creation out of nothing. Now, this objection has been brought up before, but Dr. Craig likes to mischaracterize it a bit whenever he tries to rebut it. However, I'm linking a video in the description box where Dr. Craig admits that this is a problem for the Kalam, and specifically how he's going to get around it. What's important here is that what Dr. Craig thinks is required to overcome the notion that everything material requires a material cause is that if he has good arguments and evidence that show that everything material has an absolute beginning, and was preceded by nothing, then he can get rid of the notion of everything material requiring a material cause. Notice here, though, that Craig has to accept the premise of material causation being necessary. He actually has the burden of proof to show that this is definitely not the case. And it's actually a really big burden because by his own standards, he has to show that it's not only possible that material causation isn't universally applicable, but that it absolutely is the case that it's not universally applicable. So he has to show that all material reality had an absolute beginning and that it was preceded by nothing in order to rule out that possibility. So where do we get this standard from? Well, Craig's going to give it to us. We can see it in how he responds to objections on his premise involving efficient causation. In quantum mechanics, some events are indeterminate, and it looks like they lack an efficient cause based on which interpretation of quantum mechanics you're going to hold to. So what used to be the most popular view was called the Copenhagen interpretation, and it was indeterminate. Craig very quickly objects here and says that, hey, there are other deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics, which means it hasn't been shown decisively that efficient causation as a universal principle has been violated. And you know what? He's right. The most current popular view among scientists is what's known as the many worlds interpretation, which is deterministic. Although, ironically, it entails actual infinities, but we'll get into why that's ironic later. But notice here, it's not really about which interpretation is correct. We don't actually know. It could very well be the case that Craig is wrong and the Copenhagen interpretation is correct. But since we don't know, he feels justified in holding that the efficient causation principle is true until he's conclusively shown otherwise. That's how much strength he gives to the idea of justification based on intuition and common experience. So when Craig wants to turn around and reject material causation based on the same thing, he's got a pretty high bar he set for himself to get over. Alright, so let's look at the bar. He's got to prove that all material reality has absolutely got a beginning and that it was preceded by nothing. Now, my job is going to show that he can't prove either of these two things, especially not decisively, and that when it comes down to it, there's actually evidence against such a thing being the case. There's one other thing I want to add here. At times, Craig will concede that virtual particles don't have an efficient cause, but he still claims that Kalam's premise 1 is still valid because they have a material cause. Here, Craig reverts back to the general definition of cause to try and save his premise, but in doing so, he undercuts his argument. If we have things that begin to exist with only a material and not an efficient cause, then that leaves the creation of our space-time universe as something created by exactly that process. In this scenario, a god isn't necessary to cause the universe, only some form of pre-existing material that has always existed. And then we're right back to Craig having to show that material reality must have had an absolute beginning, preceded by nothing. Now, this segues really nicely into my second major philosophical problem with the Kalam. This is Craig's major argument against some form of material reality always existing, the argument against the infinity of the past. Now, Craig starts off his argument with an assertion that an actual infinity can't exist in the real world. His actual syllogism isn't really important. It all kind of comes down to this crucial premise and how he justifies it. And he likes to prove this by going through some thought experiments like Hilbert's Hotel, and through this he shows that if an actual infinity existed in the real world, it leads to absurdities. And this is largely because he's going to subtract different values from infinity, sometimes using infinite subsets of infinite numbers, and he's going to come up with the same or contradictory answers. Now, I kind of have to admit, Craig's rhetoric here can be kind of convincing, up until the point you realize that he's treating infinity as if it were like the number 4, which is something you simply can't do. The problem for Craig is that all of the absurdities that he can pull out of different thought experiments are perfectly logically consistent with each other. It's just kind of counterintuitive because the math dealing with infinite sets is kind of complicated and it's got its own set of special rules. But the math that does deal with infinite sets is a very well-defined subject. It's called Cantorian Set Theory. This is very important because it actually serves as the foundation for most of modern mathematics. Now, Craig is smart enough to avoid trying to disprove something as well established as Cantorian Set Theory, and he actually will come out and admit that there's no logical contradiction involved in his examples. But then he makes this really odd move in saying that while Cantorian set theory is consistent, it kind of only works on paper or is a concept in your mind, and that infinity still couldn't exist in the real world. There's this great paper by a guy named Josh Denver that I'm going to link to in the description box that shows just how outrageous it is to claim that there's a branch of well-defined mathematics that's valid but doesn't apply to reality. But that's not exactly what we need to take away from this. It's just an interesting side point. What we need to take away from this is that there's no logical contradictions to any actual infinites existing in the real world. All Craig is left doing is claiming that they're metaphysically absurd, which is largely a designation that's up to an individual philosopher. One philosopher calls something absurd and another one says, it's just an oddity. Still, even if Craig was right and actual infinities are absurd means it can't exist in the real world, well, what if we amended it to be something like, if an actual infinity exists in the real world, then it would exist in such a way that it would be physically impossible to subtract from it. This would get rid of almost all of the absurdities that Craig brings up. So what if space and time were actual infinites in this way? I mean, we can't take time away. We can't take space away from itself. In fact, they're always expanding in our universe. We know this. So it's at least plausible, right? Well, what's Craig going to do? He's going to object, and he's going to say it's never been proven that space and time are a continuum. And he's right. But it's also never been proven that space and time are quantized either. We just don't know. It's entirely plausible that they're a continuum, and there's actually some evidence that suggests that's the case, and we're going to get into that later in the science section. But for now, we just want to show that it's not impossible. It's not even implausible that the past could be infinite. But the real problem I have with Craig isn't just how he tries to make an infinite past look bad. It's what he does next. Let's say, for the sake of argument, we grant Craig's claim that an actual infinite is impossible in reality. What do we get left with as his cause of the universe? This is especially problematic since Craig wants to say that time starts with the creation of the universe. Then we've got this logical problem that there can't be something before the beginning of time. Craig's answer here is that we have a God that is timeless sans creation, and it enters into time with the creation of the universe. To get around the logical impossibility of this God existing before the beginning of time, Craig claims that God's act of creation is absolutely simultaneous with the creation of the universe. Alright, there are two huge problems here, but I'm going to focus on just one for now. Remember back to our definitions. Timelessness literally means changelessness. The immediate question that comes up is, how can timeless causation even work? Now, Craig's going to answer here and say that God timelessly willed to create the universe. But I don't understand how you could will something and also be timeless, but even if we grant that's possible, how can something that's by definition changeless affect a change? Craig's only answer to this is to say that it's mysterious but not incoherent. That's it. He just goes, hey, you know what? It's mysterious, but it's at least not a squared circle. You could say the same thing about an actual infinity. Hey, look, it's mysterious, but it ain't a square circle. You know, we could even go a step further and maybe claim that timeless causation is metaphysically absurd. So at best, the Kalam relies on rejecting one supposed absurdity for another, and we're left not knowing which one is the right course to take. The key here is that no matter which way you go when it comes to the creation of the fricking universe, you're going to be left dealing with something that's counterintuitive. And like with so many things in apologetics, it may seem like two equal choices, but it's not. When it comes to actual infinities, we can at least begin to understand the concept and work with it, and it actually serves as a foundation for more concrete things like basic arithmetic. We don't have any examples of anything definitely existing that's timeless, let alone something that's timeless that can also affect a change. The worst part is that this is supposed to be the good argument that we use to reject material causation as some universal principle that goes along with Craig's efficient causation principle. Now sure, I can't prove Craig is absolutely wrong to go with a timeless causation over an infinite past, but I don't have to. Remember, he's the one making the claim, both about material causation not being universal and about this whole God thing in the first place. All I've got to do is show that he doesn't really make any conclusive case and that one can't even be made. Even if Craig wants to turn around and try to make an inference to the best explanation, the evidence is way more on the side of actual infinities instead of timeless causation. And that's going to wrap up my philosophical objections to the Kalam. Now, in the next video, I'm going to directly address how there's absolutely no good scientific evidence that show that all of material reality has an absolute beginning preceded by nothing. Thanks for watching.